What we're here looking at is a set tank for oysters. So they take the used oyster shells after they've been out and dried. They'll put them in these bags. I don't know if I can grab one up here. Here we go. And they'll put them in this water. They'll warm the water up to, it's probably about 75, 78 or something in there. They'll put them in here. Then they will buy little oyster spat, little oyster seeds from a nursery, and there'll be a little handful, will be a couple million of them at least, and they'll put them in here, and those will swim around, and they will set on the oyster shell. You have to have a warm temperature for that for 3 or 4 days, and there'll be tiny little specks on these things, and then they will grow them here for a little bit. Once they've grown out to a certain size, maybe pencil lead size or so, large pencil lead, then they'll take them and they'll grow them out in the bay. They'll set them out there for probably 3 or 4, maybe a couple months, and then they'll be big enough from there to take them out farther and dump them out where they need to grow. And the reason they're doing that is the natural set in Willapa Bay in the last 20, 30 years, or last 10 years, has gone down to, it's not dependable. The water temperatures are no longer getting warm enough for a natural set, so that you can't rely on sets, so you have to do it in these set tanks. And so all the industry has switched over to these set tanks, and it's worked, costs a lot of money, and it sort of puts a hamper on their cost of production, but it's what that everyone's doing.
What's going on here?
So we call this our nursery bed. We use our bags of oyster shells, which are called pilch, and they have baby oysters attached to the shells inside of the bags. You can see a crew back there stacking the bags. Those bags actually came out of the tank this morning at high tide. They'll stay here until the oysters on the shells are about the size of your thumbnail, and then I'll have a crew come out. They'll break the bags open into tubs. Boat will pick the tubs up at high water, dump the seed at that point out on the deck, and it'll go out to a grub bed where it'll get blown off the deck with a water hose.
The tank to here.
And how long are they here?
A couple months, and then from here they will go to another bed.
Called what? What kind of
and then for maybe a year or two, or maybe a year, depending on how much food is there. From there, then they'll pick them up and move them out to a fattening bed, where they'll leave them there to fatten up for harvest, and they might be there for a few years, or not, a few months, or a half a year, depending on the size and shape and so forth. So depending on how much fattening ground you have, you can go straight to a fattening ground, and they'll grow much faster, better. But if you don't have premier fattening bed, then you've got to grow them elsewhere and kind of rotate them through. And the fattening grounds are the ones that are being affected by burrowing shrimp, because they're at the mouth of the bay, and that's where most of the shrimp are, and that's most of where they settle. So that's the most valuable habitat, is the fattening grounds, which is up there, because you can really, and you've got to have it in order to get a quality oyster.
Kim, can you briefly describe Willapa Bay, what it is, where it's positioned, what's its size?
Okay, it is it's the largest, cleanest working estuary in North America. It's about it's about 80,000 acres. It's, I think it's smaller than San Francisco Bay, but the tidal flow, tidal prism out of the Willapa Bay twice a day is basically equal to the volume of the Mississippi River. So there's a lot of water. There's 8 rivers that drain into this thing, and it moves a lot of water, and it's what's called a geologically young estuary. So when the tide goes out, it's basically flat for miles and miles and miles and miles. A lot of estuaries are just sort of go deep, like Puget Sound, for example. It's shallow then deep. This is flat all the way out for miles, and so there's a lot of working ground. And all that then is productive oyster ground that is farmed by the shellfish industry, or DNR ground, which is leased.
How much of that 80,000 acres is farmed?
There's probably about 30,000 acres that's owned by the shellfish industry, and they actively farmed about 10,000 acres. And this bay and Grays Harbor produces a quarter of the nation's oysters, and more than half of the oysters in the state of Washington.